All right, quick break. Knock, knock. Who's there? Amazon Music. Amazon Music who? Amazon Music, where Prime members can listen to top comedy podcasts ad-free. No awkward interruptions, just nonstop laughs from your favorite shows. It's free, it's funny, and hey, it's better than my knock-knock jokes. Download the Amazon Music app and let the good times roll. Or go to amazon.com/ad-free comedy. That's amazon.com/ad-free comedy to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Hey everyone, this is Peter Zablocki, the host of the Daily History Shorts podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. If this is your first time stopping by, I hope you stick around and return tomorrow for more fun history. And if you enjoy these Friday conversation series, you can always find the entire backlog of conversations with historians, authors, Pulitzer Prize winners, and much more under the Conversations tab on our website at www.historyshortspodcast.com.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Today's episode is proudly brought to you by thecollector.com, your destination for captivating stories that teach, inform, and inspire millions of readers every day. From ancient history to today's defining moments, from philosophy and art to exclusive interviews, discover more at thecollector.com. Today I'm honored to speak with Zaakir Tameez, a brilliant author of Charles Sumner, Conscience of a Nation, a landmark biography that reintroduces one of America's most visionary yet overlooked figures. A recent Yale Law graduate, a Fulbright scholar, and an emerging scholar of constitutional and antitrust law, Zaakir has crafted a compelling narrative that brings this long pantheon of early American history and a fierce advocate of racial equality to life. Zaakir stumbled on Charles Sumner in law school when he was reading the brief that the NAACP filed in Brown v. Board of Education in the 1950s. In this brief that called for the integration of public schools, Thurgood Marshall, writing for the NAACP, cited Charles Sumner by name more than 40 times, which really sparked Zaakir's curiosity. When he saw that, he was wondering why is Sumner in this brief so much. He knew about Sumner for being attacked on the Senate floor. What he did not realize at the time was that Sumner was the single most consequential and important advocate of racial equality and civil rights of his century. Upon further digging, Zaakir came across a story of Charles Sumner as a young Harvard-educated lawyer in Boston, working for free with an African-American lawyer to help a young black girl attend an all-white school. The two men became the first interracial legal team in American history, and during the proceedings coined the term equality before the law. Arguments that were used more than a century later by the NAACP. As the story of Charles Sumner had not been told in biographical form for over 50 years, Zaakir knew it was time to reintroduce Americans to the story of Charles Sumner.
So that's exactly how I got into this book project. I was so interested in this story about Sumner's collaboration with Robert Morris that I went and read the last major comprehensive biography of Sumner's life, published by David Donald in 1960 and 1970. This 2-volume biography won the Pulitzer Prize and is around 1,000 pages in length. And guess how much time the book devotes to this groundbreaking case in the history of American law? 1 measly paragraph. And worse, this paragraph doesn't even mention the name of the black attorney, Robert Morris. And I felt that that was such an injustice to Sumner's memory, to Morris's memory, that a new biography had to be done.
So where exactly does one start this research? And what was the reaction of the people when you showed up and were like, hey, you know what? I want to know everything you know about Charles Sumner. Were they like, okay?
Yeah, no kidding. I spent quite a bit of time going to Boston. I did tours with the National Park Service of Black Boston. I did a lot of hours at the Harvard Hutton Library, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Boston Athenaeum. And as you can imagine, a lot of people were very confused and a little bit skeptical that I was going to write a biography of Charles Sumner. I did find, though, that librarians generally are the most helpful people on earth. And so whenever I spoke to librarians, even if they were skeptical, they were helping me find sources, they were talking through with me my ideas, and the best librarians were the hometown librarians at Yale Law School. So the Yale librarians worked with me to bring 84 micro reels of Charles Sumner's letters, I think from Illinois, and we shipped them to Yale, and I kept them for over a year. They helped me learn how to use the microfilm machines. I'm a young guy. I got to be honest, I never thought growing up that I would be using microfilm.
I remember using hours spent in basements of libraries in college.
I know, and you can imagine my parents' confusion that I'm using microfilm. And now I know how to use it a lot better than they do, right? But yeah, like it was definitely a journey. It was a lot of content. It took some time to get my arms around it. And there was definitely some skepticism, but I was just having such a good time. He's an amazing writer. He is very, very expressive and sarcastic and sometimes intentionally funny, more often unintentionally funny in his letters. And I just enjoyed pulling all those quotes and trying to use as much of that in the book as possible to let Sumner speak for Sumner.
You mentioned in the book that Charles Sumner is considered one of the most famous civil rights leaders of the 19th century. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, let me paint you a picture of America in the 1850s. By this time, around 1/4 of the Southern population is enslaved by the other 3/4. Slavery is on the rise. It is rapidly expanding in the South, but also in the West. And slaveholders are terrified of domestic rebellion. To protect their regime, slaveholders are doing everything to suppress abolitionist dissent. In many southern states, it was a criminal violation to speak against slavery. Southern states monitored the mail to watch for abolitionist tracks. And of course, southern states are tightly regulating where African Americans can be, what they can do. Even free blacks, as we all know, were not really free. And many of those same provisions were also being imposed on the North. The Fugitive Slave Act being the worst example, but just one of many ways in which blacks in North and South are not free, are constantly at risk, are constantly supervised, marginalized, oppressed, and brutalized. So in this context, you have different strands of the movement. You have some people who are speaking pretty much only about the free speech question, free speech for anti-slavery advocates. You have others who are anti-slavery, and their main occupation is speaking against the slave power. And then you have another branch, the smallest of the three, that is advocating for real racial equality. And Sumner represents that trifecta: free speech, anti-slavery, and racial equality. And this triple entente was extremely rare, particularly among white abolitionists. There were very few white abolitionists in the North who not only believed that slavery was wrong, but also that segregation was wrong, who not only protected or fought for the free speech rights of abolitionists, but also fought for the right of a 5-year-old black girl to go to a white-only school. And because he represented those three tenets, free speech, anti-slavery, and equal rights, he is, in my view, the most significant white civil rights leader of the 19th century.
You mentioned in the book that a lot of that comes up from his upbringing.
Right. Sumner grew up in a series of contradictions. I'll tell you about two. The first contradiction is that he is a third-generation Harvard-educated man. But he grew up in poverty because his father was, frankly, a really bad lawyer. And as a result, they didn't have much money, which leads to the second contradiction. Even with this aristocratic education, his father chose to raise the family in an impoverished neighborhood in Boston that was really an ethnic enclave for free African Americans. And so Sumner had this amazing upbringing where he is seeing black school children, he has black neighbors, he is seeing and meeting black writers, musicians, and of course, black workers of all kinds. His father was known to treat African Americans on the streets with deep respect. And yet, Sumner is also acculturated into this aristocratic education. He goes to Harvard himself. He becomes mentored by Joseph Story, a very prominent Supreme Court justice who teaches at Harvard Law School. And Story and other professors train him to be a conservative who will preserve the status quo and who will be a corporate lawyer. And so Sumner becomes that because his mentors wanted that for him. And yet he has this deep guilt in his 20s and in his 30s because he is at once a corporate lawyer serving the Boston merchant class, many of whom had financial ties to the slave system, while he is still living in his mother's home in a predominantly black neighborhood in Boston. And after a long time, he finally decides to use his legal training to serve that community of his upbringing.
The one event that makes Sumner known to modern readers or students is the fact he was beaten on the Senate floor. What was the reaction to that at the time? How did that propel Sumner's career going forward?
Let me tell you about the caning. By the 1850s, slavery is rapidly expanding west, and all this comes to fore in the territory of Kansas. Kansas is going to have a vote on whether it will become a slave state or a free state. Slaveholders are so adamant that Kansas becomes a slave state that many pro-slavery politicians are willing to use violence to get their way. Sumner had a former colleague named David Rice Atchison, the former president pro tem of the Senate, a senator from Missouri. Atchison went back to Missouri, organized a gang of more than 1,000 men, storms into Kansas, and starts to take over polling locations at gunpoint. Meanwhile, there is relative quiet in Washington, D.C. Even many anti-slavery northern politicians are not speaking out, or if they are, they're speaking out in a very muted fashion. And that's because Washington is a slave city. It is a southern city. Anti-slavery politicians would get death threats, would get harassed and accosted on the streets of Washington. So naturally, they're scared. And Sumner, after a while, decides that even though he and his colleagues are scared, they have no choice. They have a duty to American democracy to speak out. And that is exactly what Charles Sumner does. He writes The Crime Against Kansas, one of the most famous speeches in American history. This speech is 130 pages long, He memorized it entirely. He delivers it over 2 days. And in that speech, he just goes after these pro-slavery politicians. I mean, he really digs into them. He compares David Atchison to a Roman traitor. He describes President Pierce as a Roman dictator. He targets Stephen Douglas of Illinois and basically compares him to Lucifer incarnate. And he especially targets Andrew Pickens Butler of South Carolina, who is recently recovering from a stroke. Sumner says that Butler had a speech impediment, makes fun of it. He says the state of South Carolina could be blotted out of existence and civilization would look the same. And then he says that Butler has a mistress, ugly in the sight of the world, but beautiful in his eyes, the harlot slavery. Through this research, I found a report from one of Butler's former slaves who recalled that Butler did indeed have a mistress, probably an enslaved woman that Butler had raped and sired children by her, and probably Butler's children were also slaves of his. And Sumner is basically telling the whole world about Butler's infractions. That doesn't go over well, naturally, in the Senate. Unbeknownst to Sumner, Andrew Butler had a nephew, Preston Brooks, who was serving in the House of Representatives. And it is Brooks who comes after Sumner a couple days later with a gold-tipped gutta-percha cane and starts to beat him over the head, leaving him bloody and unconscious on the Senate floor.
Reading in your book, it kind of seems like he becomes a martyr for the Republican Party after this event, before Abraham Lincoln does.
That's right. The caning took place in late May 1856. That summer, the newly created Republican Party organizes its first convention ever. And at that new Republican National Convention, the first RNC, the Republicans chant Charles Sumner's name in unison over and over and over again. He's not there, and yet they are chanting his name. The Republican Party printed as many as 3 million copies of the crime against Kansas. They're campaigning everywhere, both on the issue of free speech, pointing out that Sumner was attacked for his speech, and also campaigning directly on the slavery issue. Sumner repeatedly, whenever a reporter spoke to him, connected his physical beating with the beatings that were going on in the South on the daily. He continued to repeatedly emphasize that what he went through is nothing compared to what enslaved people go through every single day. And that evoked sympathy and empathy across the white North for the experiences of enslaved people. And there was a recognition that as long as slavery existed in this country, no one was free, not even white people.
Reading your book, one realizes how involved Charles Sumner was in a lot of events that we read about in textbooks, events that are often associated with not just the Republican Party, but also Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he was there during the Emancipation Proclamation draft. He was there during the push for the 13th Amendment, and yet he doesn't really take center stage. Why do you think that is?
He's an admirable figure in 100 different ways, but he is also quite flawed. He's very hard to get along with. He's conceited. He is aggressive. He didn't know moderation. One of his friends once said that Sumner uses words as boys use stones. to knock down flower pots and break windows. And that was how he was. He often would fight people around him. He was difficult. He didn't spend time in the minutiae of legislation. He wasn't particularly likable among his white colleagues. But by contrast, he is loved and revered by Black America. Frederick Douglass once said that Sumner was like the North Star. He said that Sumner was probably the greatest white politician of his time. Many other Black leaders regarded Sumner as one of theirs. Sumner once said to a Black pastor, quote, "In my feelings and sympathies, I am a colored man." So while Sumner is forgotten in many respects by white historians, by white America in the generations following, he was never forgotten by Black America. You can go through volumes of the Journal of Negro History, the leading Black journal for Black historians in the early 20th century. Sumner's name is everywhere. The NAACP organized at least 3 events to celebrate Charles Sumner's birthday in 1911. Sumner's name is everywhere in the brief filed by the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall in the 1950s in Brown. So Sumner is, yes, forgotten by white America. He was never forgotten by Black America.
Apart from being one of the greatest abolitionists of his time, Sumner was also dubbed the great defender of the Constitution. As a legal scholar yourself, how did your understanding of constitutional law shape the portrayal of Sumner's efforts to define, or maybe we should say, redefine the Constitution during and after Reconstruction?
Yeah. So first on my background, then on Sumner. I attended law school at Yale University. And at Yale, like many schools, most people on the left are taught to treat the Constitution as a living document and to have a lot of reverence for the Supreme Court's precedents on constitutional law, particularly from the Warren Court. This includes Brown versus Board. This includes Miranda. This includes a number of seminal cases from that era. And we are taught to think that constitutional law is the realm of lawyers and judges who are interpreting based on new circumstances and adapting the law to be more inclusive and just with every passing day. So that's the attitude I'm coming in when I start to study Charles Sumner. And Sumner was known in his time as a brilliant constitutional lawyer. As you mentioned, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the most famous anti-slavery novel, one of the most famous novels of all time, she called Sumner the, quote, great defender of the Constitution. And what amazed me as I started to look at Sumner's constitutional jurisprudence, I was struck that he always referred to history, and he always tied his ideas right back to the founding and to the founders. So, for example, he never argued that slavery itself was unconstitutional in the states. Instead, he pointed out that no slavery existed in national territories at the time of the founding. And he makes all these clever originalist arguments, originalism being the theory that we should interpret the Constitution the way it was originally understood. And this is really striking because for someone as radical and progressive as him, we would not expect that person to be an originalist. But he was. He looked at history, and also when he did look at history, he looked for a positive spin on the history, so to speak. So, for example, as he pointed out, George Washington was a slaveholder, but Washington freed all his slaves in his will. And Sumner says Washington on earth was a slaveholder, but Washington in heaven is an abolitionist. With Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson was a brutal enslaver, but Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence. Sumner takes that language and runs with it. He argues that when you look to history, you must construe all historical facts in favor of liberty. So he has what I call a theory of constitutional law that I describe as aspirational originalism. Yes, it's originalism based on history, but it is looking for the aspirations of the founders rather than the failures of the founders. And it is calling on us as a country to practice law and interpret law based on the highest ideals of the founders rather than on their moral failings.
I guess there must have been some kind of level of fun for you as a legal scholar to read all these legal documents, or at the least, it was definitely useful to understand them. For me, if I had to read this stuff, it would take another detour to try to understand all of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And part of what got me so excited about writing this book was seeing how much Sumner contributed to revolutionizing constitutional law in the 1860s. I'll give you one example. At the end of the decade, or maybe it was in 1870, Sumner collaborates with the black law professor, John Mercer Langston, on drafting the Civil Rights Bill. This bill was essentially a national integration bill. It would have created a right of public accommodation for anyone regardless of race, that you could enter a streetcar or a restaurant or a hotel or a theater regardless of what race you are. And if you are prevented, you would have a right to sue and collect damages. So Sumner introduces this bill. It is not getting traction because many Republicans by this time, even though they have abolished slavery, even though they have established birthright citizenship, even though they have granted black men the right to vote, they are not eager about racial integration, about being in the same schools and the same hotels and the same restaurants as African Americans. So Sumner is debating with one of his moderate Republican colleagues. And the moderate argues that this bill infringes on state rights. It was legislating in domains that the national government had never legislated in before. And Sumner responds and says to this man, "You are referring to the old method of constitutional interpretation." He said, "I'm referring to the method that was conquered at Appomattox." Appomattox being the last battle of the Civil War. He said that under the new rule of interpretation, every clause, every line, and every word of the Constitution is to be interpreted uniformly and thoroughly in favor of human rights. And this is huge. He's using the language of human rights constitutionalism in the 1870s. He wasn't alone, and he believed that the Civil War itself inaugurated a new mode of constitutionalism. Even for those who disagreed with that, he constantly pointed to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These amendments are famous for their first sections, Section 1 of the 13th, Section 1 of the 14th, Section 1 of the 15th. But each amendment also had a final section, Section 2 of the 13th, Section 5 of the 14th, and Section 2 of the 15th, known as the Enforcement Clause. That section in each of those amendments basically said that Congress shall enforce this amendment by any appropriate means. And we look at this language today, and it just seems like boring legalistic language, not important. But to Sumner, this was the most important part of all three of those constitutional amendments, because these were giving new enforcement powers to Congress. This is huge because it was the first time in American history that the Constitution had been amended to increase Congress's powers rather than decrease them. The Bill of Rights is all about putting limitations on congressional power. The Reconstruction Amendments expand congressional power in order to enforce the abolition of slavery, enforce birthright citizenship, enforce equal protection, enforce the protection of black voting rights. And to Sumner, these enforcement clauses authorize Congress to legislate in any domain related to human rights. And that was his constitutional philosophy during this period, which many legal scholars now refer to as America's second founding.
A lot of his ideas eventually did become integrated into the Civil Rights Act of 1964, correct?
Yeah, I gasped when I read the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And I saw that the first two provisions are pretty much verbatim from what Charles Sumner and John Langston wrote together in 1871. Like, we could have had all this nearly 100 years earlier. And it's the tragedy of this book, of Charles Sumner's life, that we didn't achieve a lasting, durable, multiracial democracy at the end of Sumner's life. But it's the glory of Charles Sumner that all those decades later, his ideas become the framework, the blueprint of modern civil rights law.
And none of that is actually mentioned in American, at least high school textbooks. I mean, I taught high school history for many years, and none of this was mentioned about Charles Sumner. I think your book is really timely and does a great job bringing all this out into the open again. Again, you did a great job writing this. This was very informative, and I think it is very timely.
Thank you. My pitch to publishers when I first wrote this book is that every single high school student learns about Charles Sumner in U.S. history class. And as a history teacher, you know that's true. A lot of publishers didn't realize that. And I remember one agent called me and she said that she wasn't going to respond to my pitch. She wasn't interested in the book. She had never heard of Charles Sumner before. But then at dinner, she decided to ask her kids if they knew who Charles Sumner was. And her kids responded, "Oh yeah, that's the guy who got caned." So they had known about Charles Sumner from learning about it from their U.S. history teacher. And I think it's so important to tell this story because high school students and high school history teachers know about the caning of Charles Sumner, but usually don't know much else. And the caning is the hook to telling this much broader, more powerful story about a real champion of racial equality, a true white ally who stood in solidarity with African Americans, whose story is so central to the American constitutional project, and whose story, I hope, gets to be told everywhere in high schools across this country.
My last question for you today is, in what ways do you see parallels between the political polarization of Sumner's era and then today's divided landscape? And how might his strategies or examples or leadership for confronting injustice inform our current challenges? In other words, what can we learn from Charles Sumner today?
Yeah, it's funny you ask that because a lot of people ask me, as a historian of the Civil War, what we can learn from that time period on how to heal divisions, bring people together, and avoid a calamity today. And it's an awkward question for me because the answer they want to hear is compromise and concession and working together, and that's just not Charles Sumner's MO. Like, if you want to learn about that, you're going to have to ask a biographer of somebody else because Charles Sumner was not about that, right? Charles Sumner believed in the politics of courage, not the politics of concession. When he entered Washington, he was not looking to bridge divides between the North and the South. He was not looking to form new political compromises. He had come in shortly after the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act that basically criminalized black identity in the North. He's old enough to remember the Compromise of 1830, where slavery was allowed to spread across the Western territories underneath the Mason-Dixon line. To him, he said the country was, quote, afflicted by compromise, almost as if compromise was a kind of disease. He was furious because he kept seeing compromises against human dignity. And he said, quote, there should be no compromises on human rights. So to him, he rejected the politics of compromise. Instead, he believed in the politics of courage, living amongst death threats, living amongst the fear of what might happen to the country. He continued to stand for principles no matter what. He said there are few who stand firm like the oak tree against the storm. And in many ways, maybe we are experiencing political storm today. And I think the lesson from Sumner's life, or at least the advice that Sumner would give, is to stand firm like an oak tree, to stay true to principles, not to compromise on human rights. And that, he thought, was the best way to preserve, defend, and expand American democracy and to fight for racial equality.
If there was a movie made about this, think of like Lincoln and Spielberg, right? Who would play Charles Sumner?
Well, that would be the dream. So if any producers are listening to your show, I'm all ears. Please do contact me. The film rights are available. I don't know, he's an amazing figure. He's really fascinating. He was probably gay, as I argue in the book. He may have been on the autism spectrum.
And he's like 6'5" or something?
Right, yeah, I should have started with that. He's 6'4". We just got to find the right actor. I think there's a few out there. They're going to have to grow out their sideburns, so I hope they're okay with that.
Zaakir, what are you working on next? I mean, you wrote this book over a few years while you were going to law school, which is amazing, and you're also pursuing your career as a legal scholar and a lawyer. So do you have an itch to maybe get started on another book?
I've got the itch for sure. This will not be the last book. I'm thinking about a few different ideas. I haven't nailed it down quite yet, but I hope a new book is on the way. I think there's so many powerful stories, particularly from this era. I think we are in a moment in America where we're looking for new heroes and we're looking to surface stories of forgotten people who are fundamental to American democracy. And I want to tell those stories however I can.
Zaakir, where can my listeners go to learn more about your work?
I have a website, nothing to brag about. It's charles-sumner.com, where you can learn a little bit more. But I'll definitely have to build it out. And I'm also freely available by email, and you can contact me on LinkedIn, wherever you want to reach me for doing book talks, for doing events, for exploring potential partnerships. I'm all ears.
Zaakir, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was a great conversation.
Thank you very much, Peter.